Good evening. Thank you very much for tuning in to tonight's event and in conversation with Amber Rudd and Craig Oliver. Thank you very much, Craig and Amber, for joining us tonight. Just a reminder before we begin, while I will be directing the discussions this evening, you as an audience can participate in tonight's interview by sending in questions using our online form, which is linked in the description below. I will try my very best to pick out as many as possible. Amber Rudd was the MP for Hastings and Rye from 2010 to 2019. She served as Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change in David Cameron's government before becoming Home Secretary under Theresa May. Amber was also Secretary of State for Work and Pensions under May and then Boris Johnson before standing down prior to the general election amidst disagreements about a no-deal Brexit and the prorogation of Parliament. Craig Oliver was David Cameron's Director of Communications for over 6 years. In that time, he played a central role in both the Conservative 2015 general election campaign and the Remain campaign during the 2016 EU referendum. Craig's Unleashing Demons, the inside story of Brexit, was published in October 2016. I'm sure none of those introductions did you both much justice, so I thought it might be good to allow you to introduce yourselves first off, and particularly tell us a little bit more about what you've been doing since leaving political office. Amber, why don't you go first?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, great pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting us, Freddie. I know a little bit about university events like this. The last one I was scheduled to talk at in Oxford, I was cancelled at. So I'm glad that this one has gone ahead, even though it's only virtual. Since leaving office in 2019, I had a good think about what I wanted to do. And the areas that I'm most interested in are in energy and cybersecurity. So I decided to look for work in those areas. And I've been doing some writing and talking and thinking in those two areas. And I have some experience on the political side of working in those areas, particularly in the energy sector. And I now do some work for a number of companies in energy and a little bit in cybersecurity. In energy, my main job is with Equinor, which is the Norwegian state oil company, which is 80% owned by the government of Norway. And I chair their senior advisory board. We look at big strategic issues to do with energy, to do with the energy transition, and to do with foreign policy, which is a fascinating role. I feel very, very lucky. And I really enjoyed being back in the private sector. In a way, for me, politics was the odd thing that I did. I did it for 10 years, but really I enjoy working in the private sector. So I'm back in the private sector where I was before I went into politics, and now really working in what I think is one of the most important areas for us all to get right, which is handling the energy transition fast enough to make sure that we don't heat up this planet too much. Thank you.
Sorry, Kate, you might need to come up mute.
Muting myself, yes. Somebody's always got to do that, haven't they, at the beginning of a call. So like Amber, politics is a bit of an aberration for me. I was a broadcast journalist. I eventually ended up editing the BBC 6 and 10 o'clock news. Then I went on to run BBC Global. And then completely out of the blue in January 2011, I got a call from David Cameron, and he said, "Do you want to be my Director of Politics and Communications?" And I said, sure. And I think it's like curiosity killed the cat. It's like, if you're a journalist, you can't turn that kind of thing down. You've always spent your time as a journalist with your nose pressed up against the glass, trying to work out what's going on inside. And then somebody says, look, come inside and have a look around. I nearly gave up after about 6 months, because I think that politics has got a history of people who are successful outside going into politics, and then they basically are a bit like being thrown into the whitewater rapids. It's just like nothing you've ever experienced before. But then eventually you work out how to do it, and you work out how to ready yourself, and then spent 6 very enjoyable years doing it. Apart from the Brexit year. Since Brexit, I wrote the book that you discussed, which they made into a film, and I had a very weird experience of being played by Rory Kinnear in that film. And then I got given a job by a company called Teneo, which is a CEO advisory firm. It started in New York, but we basically advise S&P and FTSE 100 CEOs on their businesses, quite a few private businesses too. And Amber is a senior advisor at Teneo as well, so we spend quite a lot of time talking to each other.
Well, I'm glad you know each other well, and I've said before this call, but do feel free to interject and ask each other questions. I'm here as a guiding hand, but not an authoritarian interviewer or chair. I just want to focus on your reasons for getting into politics a little bit more, and the time in which you both entered UK politics. Many might call you One Nation Conservatives, and it would be interesting to hear your views on that. It's a term that David Cameron owned and Theresa May subsequently laid claims to, but evidently the social and economic inflections were maybe a bit different. It's quite an ambiguous term too. What do you consider One Nation Conservatism to mean? And are you One Nation Conservatives?
I'll answer for myself because Craig, I'm not sure Craig is even a Conservative, so we'll wait and hear that information from him later. But I am definitely a One Nation Conservative. It's fair enough that it's a slightly ambiguous term, but those of us who use it know it means a sort of centrist conservative. The One Nation Conservatives were unlikely to be on the right of the party. They were unlikely to be Brexiteers. They were, in my view, more thoughtful about what Boris Johnson now calls levelling up. And generally consensus politicians, really. And, you know, Margaret Thatcher was famously against her One Nation Conservatives, but we were a force for good with David Cameron, I feel, and thoughtful about the big issues like climate change. That wasn't an area that was wholly popular at the time when David Cameron really embraced it. I went into politics as rather as a surprise to myself. I'd always been interested in current affairs. I'd always been active locally in my community, sort of campaigning for this thing and that thing. And actually, it was a rather classic one, which I now try on everybody else, which rather alarms them. When you're having a big current affairs discussion in a bar or at a dinner, and somebody who's not involved in politics keeps on going on about how you could do it better. You could do this, you could do that. And I was that person. And so somebody turned to me who was a politician and said, well, you try it. So I thought, well, that's what I'm going to do. And so the sort of curtain dropped from my face and I thought, right, I'm going to go and see the Conservative Party. I was a member of the party. So I went and saw them, and I was just very fortunate, really, because I threw myself into becoming a member of Parliament at a time when the party was changing. It was changing in that it now wanted more women, and it was changing in that it had a stronger sense of direction under David Cameron as to what it wanted to achieve. And it particularly wanted some new MPs who had some experience. So I was older than a lot of new MPs when I got elected in 2010, but that was considered an advantage, which is a good thing, because I think it was an advantage. And I think it's, you can have MPs of all sorts of different ages and backgrounds, but there's nothing wrong with having a few MPs joining who have 15 years or so experience in the private sector to bring some really street knowledge of what's going on and how government can really help people support their businesses, create employment, etc. So for me, that was the guiding principle, really, was coming out of business and my local community, and the fact that the Conservative Party had changed and was making it possible, because up until 2010, it was very difficult to get selected or elected as a woman Conservative MP.
So when I was, Lynton Crosby invited me to be his deputy in the 2015 general election campaign. So I had to move from number 10 to CCHQ and sit next to him running the campaign. And he came in, we used to have these 5 a.m. morning meetings. And this was a real introduction to politics. And this is the kind of thing that people like Amber hate to hear. But we had a meeting at 5 a.m., which was the real meeting. And there were 4 of us in it. And then we had a whole succession of meetings after that were fake meetings, pretending that these people had some say in what the campaign was doing. And they finished at 8:10 each morning with the cabinet meeting, where we pretended that we were consulting all of them on their great thoughts about what was going on. But anyway, one morning when I turned up at 5 a.m., Lynton said, mate, we've got the polling card for your area, and it says you're a fucking Lib Dem, mate. And basically, they claimed to have canvassed me, and I'd apparently said I was Lib Dem, which I don't remember at all, but I wasn't. David Cameron offered me the job, and I genuinely had to think really hard about whether I was a Conservative. And that's because I'd spent all my life being a broadcast journalist, where you have this kind of monkish impartiality enforced on you, and it makes you try and imagine your way into different political parties and that kind of thing. So I spent a weekend when I was offered the job reading his manifesto, met him, talked to him, liked his idea of sound money and socially liberal values. We did things like gay marriage when David Cameron was in number 10, very socially liberal, and I felt very comfortable about that. I think that the question of, am I a Conservative, I would also say to Amber, are you a Conservative? Because you were thrown out of the Conservative Party for daring to vote against the government on Remain. And I think that people like me and Amber aren't really, or weren't really welcome for quite some time in the Conservative Party. I think it's changing now. I think that it's sort of trying to woo people back and bring people in as the heat goes out of Brexit. But it's certainly true. I would say I was sound money and socially liberal values. This is a government that isn't terribly sound in money for all sorts of obvious reasons, and isn't perhaps very socially liberal in that it's got a Home Secretary that believes in capital punishment. So I think the question, are you a Conservative, is quite a good one. What is it at the moment?
It is interesting to reflect on that question. As you've sort of indicated, this one nation term often has connotations of being socially and economically liberal, or socially liberal and economically pragmatic are the two terms that are often conjoined. Is it an ideological term, or is one nationism pragmatic? And if so, what's the current Conservative Party? Is it ideological or is it pragmatic?
I think that it's pragmatic, really, describing oneself as one nation. And a lot of my Conservative contemporaries were proud to say we're not ideological, we are pragmatic. We want to do what we think can deliver the best outcomes in terms of the values that we believe in, about being socially liberal, as Craig said, but being fiscally responsible. And in a way, that was the defining difference, really, between the Conservative and Labour, which was being fiscally responsible, understanding about sound money. And Labour had shown, well, consistently, really, that they were unable to do so. I mean, what your question, Freddie, of what now, what does it look like now, is much more difficult to answer, because this government has been one that has been driven by Brexit. And even though the Prime Minister would like to have Brexit put aside, at the same time, everything still circles around Brexit. You don't get promoted unless you are able to say that you love Brexit. So that means that the whole cabinet and ministerial ranks are, well, you have to fish from a slightly smaller pool in order to do that, but is also full of contradictions, because not everybody thinks that, even though they are willing to participate in the support for a government that leads with that. And I also think there is a problem with Brexit, which is most of the people that I know who are still in Parliament or who are out of Parliament, like myself, who are Conservatives and who were Remainers, are not trying to overturn it. We regret it, but we accept it. But the government is determined to continue to jab at Brexit to make sure that it's not quite over, so that they can always point to the EU as making it difficult. They can always point to Labour as trying to overturn it. So I worry that there's this contradiction with the government at the moment, that on the one hand, they want us to focus on other things. On the other hand, they can't resist using Brexit to continually score points.
Yeah, and I think that I'm remembering the night of the 2015 election, which nobody thought we'd won. And then there was a moment where suddenly we did win a majority. And I was in David Cameron's camp with him. And we were walking down the stairs at very, the small hours of the morning when he was about to give his speech. And he was like, we were talking about what he was going to say. And I remember saying to him, one nation, one United Kingdom, say that. And then, as a very good politician, he took it and ran with it. And basically, what did we mean by that? That we wanted to be in a country that felt where it was inclusive, where it felt that you weren't sort of shut out, that you weren't crossing the road to pick a fight. And one of the things that David Cameron said to me when he offered me a job was, I want number 10 to be where the nice people are. And I thought that was quite an odd thing to say. But when I sort of reflected on it, looking back over the years, what he really meant was, we're not dickheads. We're not going out of our way to pick fights. We're not being objectionable. And again, I don't say this as a criticism of the current regime. Politics feels like it's shifted. It feels like it is much more tribal. It feels like it is much more about picking fights and which tribe are you in. And I think that was what was interesting, was that we, as liberal conservatives, metropolitan, yes, probably fair enough to point the finger of saying elitist, had not spotted the extent to which that tribalism was bubbling and growing and was an issue in the country. And I think that one of the reasons for the success of this government, even though it's made quite a few serious mistakes, is it's properly understood that. Now, you may not like it, but it's properly understood that politically, and is actually politically, not necessarily organisationally or other ways, but is politically actually being very successful at the moment.
It's interesting you say politics has profoundly changed in recent years. I mean, 2016 has to be a turning point, and you're both heavily involved in leading the Remain campaign. So I wonder if we can just focus on that for a little bit. The polls suggested that results were in your favour by a substantial margin, although that narrowed substantially as we got closer to the vote. There's a lot to unpack here, and Craig, you discussed the dynamics of the referendum in detail in your book. In a nutshell, what do you think went wrong, and could a different campaign strategy have changed the outcome?
Two things. The Labour Party did not fight the campaign, and that is not a party political point, but if Ed Miliband had been running Labour at that time, or Ed Balls or Yvette Cooper or any number of people, they would have grabbed the campaign by the scruff of the neck, and they would have made clear that it was not in the interests of working people to leave the EU. Jeremy Corbyn went on holiday for 7 days during the middle of it. We literally set up events for very senior people like John McDonnell. They wouldn't turn up, which would leave a big void in the schedule of communication. So one of the things is Labour. That's a secondary issue. The main issue is immigration. I don't think anybody had spotted the extent to which immigration could be weaponised as an issue. And one of the things that I spent probably 4 years, every day, somebody picking a fight with me saying, why didn't you have a more positive campaign? Why didn't you make the case for immigration more? There's two reasons for that. The immigration case was that when you reduce that argument to its most basic, which you have to in politics, we were recommending that we stay part of an institution that said you had to have unlimited immigration regardless of circumstance. And most people, when you tell them that, think you're nuts. And by the way, they've got a point. It is not a very good idea to say that your borders are completely open and anybody can come in to any extent, and people just don't like it politically. It's a real problem. And that issue was massively weaponized. I personally think that if I could have invented a time machine and gone back 40 years and forced successive leaders to make the case for immigration and make the case for the EU, we might have persuaded people on it. But trying to do it in a very short period of time in a campaign was never going to work. And I know I'm talking a lot here, but one final point. People who say, why didn't you run a more positive campaign? It's sort of tempting to say, do you think we didn't think of that? The reason is, we tested the people who were in play as voters. And when you ran the positive campaign, when you suggested that you link arms and sing Ode to Joy, and isn't it brilliant that we've had 80 years of peace and it's all wonderful that we're one big melting point of Europe, part of Europe, but isn't it amazing? People hated it. It forced them into the other camp. And I think that the people just really struggle to understand that, but that's absolutely what happened. And running a positive campaign was just not where it was at.
Well, I think that sort of sums it up. There were some extraordinary characters who were part of it. I think that Nigel Farage basically had done a very effective job at ramping up people's anxieties about immigration. So it was fertile ground when it came to the referendum for him to push again, and as did the Vote Leave campaign, on how immigration was adversely affecting people, so they said.
You're allowed to push back. You're allowed to tell us we're wrong, Freddie.
Well, I think it's interesting that, to me, I'm very familiar with Gordon Brown's quite well shared video about Lead Not Leave, and it was one of the more popular videos circulating in the Remain campaign. I don't know, I live in England, I don't know what the dynamics were like in Scotland, and maybe they were more fertile to a positive campaign. But I know there are a lot of people criticising and saying that video was very, very powerful. I wonder what your thoughts were on that particular video and the campaign in Scotland.
I think it's very powerful if you're already persuaded that the EU is a thoroughly good thing. But the thing is, in a campaign, you're not trying to persuade the people who are already going to vote for you. You're trying to persuade the people who are in play. And you have to listen to them. And I think one of the things that I found frustrating about my fellow Remainers over the last few years is they've just refused to accept reality. A lot of them have refused to accept, why is it possible that these people voted in this way? Why did they do that? It's like, it's almost as if they've almost got to the point of suggesting that democracy actually is a thoroughly bad thing because people do stupid things because of it, which is like madness, because you're not actually listening to people or hearing why they behaved in the way that they did. So look, yeah, I mean, Gordon Brown, very powerful argument. He can be a great orator. You know, Scotland is a very different, my family live in Scotland. It's a very different place to a lot of England, and it was always going to vote Remain. He was preaching to the choir, I think, there.
And it leaves us, of course, with the very live problem now of the potential for the SNP to do very well in the May elections, as all those people who voted to Remain do not. They are more likely now to think about voting SNP because they don't like the fact that as a United Kingdom, we have left the European Union. And there's a kind of niggling grievance there that they will come back to at some stage.
Craig, there are some wonderful exchanges which you describe in your book, Unleashing Demons, exchanges between members of the Remain campaign and also members of cabinet too. There's one particular instance when you explain when Michael Gove declares for out, Cameron greets this sort of act of personal political betrayal by sort of shrugging, well, that's him off the Christmas card list. Pithiness aside, do you think Cameron was too relaxed? Was the Remain camp too complacent?
I think it's interesting because the morning of the Remain loss, or the morning of Brexit, I was in his study at like 4 a.m. and like literally discussing, was he going to resign, and then watching him walk down the corridor and go up the stairs to his flat, and just seeing somebody who'd given it his all, just utterly defeated. And I think that is the hardest thing. It's like when you're in the trenches, you're out of ammunition, and everybody's bayoneting each other. It's bloody. I mean, it's horrible. And he gave everything, and I think we all did. And then he came down the next morning, and I was still sort of sitting, helping draft his resignation speech, and he just walked in and he just sort of looked at the group and he went, well, that went well, didn't it? And that was sort of typical of him. He was sort of trying to lighten the mood and with a bad joke and that kind of thing. But no, I don't think so. And I think that the thing about David Cameron is that it's such a hoary old cliche, but it's like the swan. You sort of glide across the water, but actually you're pedaling very hard beneath it. I mean, no Prime Minister, maybe Boris, no Prime Minister doesn't work very hard.
I don't know if you wanted to come in there, Amber, but if not, I'm interested particularly in your experiences post 2016.
Oh, thank goodness. I don't think I can go back over 2016 too much again. It was such a painful time, Freddie. Moving on. Yes. Moving on. I'm not going to move on for Brexit just for the moment, so I'm sorry about that. But moving past the immediate referendum, Brexit was as a major reason for your cabinet resignation in 2019, and perhaps related to why you stepped down as MP. Although feel free to come in on that. As EU negotiations sort of dragged on from 2016 onwards, did relationships with other cabinet members change or break down? Actually, I mean, the first couple of years after Brexit vote went through, it didn't dominate politics anyway in the cabinet, the same way that it did sort of 1819, when it really got accelerated in terms of leading finally to Theresa May's resignation and Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister. The first 2 years, we were running a government under Theresa May. There were meetings of a Brexit cabinet committee, which I was on, to try and help Theresa May find an agreement with the EU. And you had the Brexiteers on one side and the Remainers on the other side. So you had, me and David Gauke and Philip Hammond. And then you had, and for a while we had Michael Fallon and Damien Green, of course. Anyway, you had them kind of, people took their positions, and these meetings would sort of debate the positions that the Prime Minister and her advisor, Oliver Robbins, were trying to take. But government continued, I think, quite effectively. And, as Home Secretary, there were all sorts of things I was doing that had nothing to do with Brexit at all. It was only in the last couple of years that things became overwhelmed by Brexit, as it became clear that the Parliament that we had become after we lost the majority in 2017 couldn't deliver, and the Brexiteers were not prepared to support Theresa May's essentially compromise deal. Under Theresa May, we had a decision really as a government whether we were going to do a soft or hard Brexit. And in the end, she tried to do a soft Brexit, couldn't get it through. Boris Johnson came in and did a hard Brexit. Under him, it was a hard Brexit or no deal at all. So it just ratcheted up. And from my point of view, I didn't like the way he governed. I couldn't support the approach to prorogation, asking, defenestrating effectively so many of my colleagues. Not actually me, Craig. I wasn't defenestrated. I volunteered to jump out of the window in order to support them, and looked behind me and there was nobody else. It was called doing a James Pennell, I think, by some of my colleagues. So I knew I had to resign. But actually, on reflection over those past 5 years, I think that if Michael Gove hadn't stabbed Boris in that early election for a leader in 2016, we would have got Boris probably then, and we wouldn't have had to have gone through those now last 3 or 4 years of pain. What do you think, Craig?
No, I think that's right. So Prospect magazine did, this kind of alternative future at Christmas. And I don't know why they thought people would consider that a Christmas present, but I was one of the people who had to predict the future if what would have happened if David Cameron had stayed on as Prime Minister afterwards. And basically, I think if you game it, Boris would have become Prime Minister quicker. And I suspect we probably would have been saved quite a lot of the pain that we ultimately went through, although that's not to say I feel comfortable with people basically being chucked out of the party who were the Remain side of it. And I do worry about that. I think that this is a bigger point. I think that both of the main political parties now have too narrow a group of people in Parliament and also as members, and that has a very distorting effect on our politics.
I think that's true. And I think that, the Labour Party has its own problems, which are unresolved. But the Conservative Party, I regret the fact that those of us who are Conservatives and believe that the country should be leading the EU no longer have a place in the Conservative Party. And young people I know who take that view can no longer try and become a member of Parliament, because the members of the Conservative Party who choose the candidates to be the MPs are very keen on Brexit. And it's not that these other candidates might want to, they wouldn't think about trying to overturn it, but they don't love it. And you have to love Brexit in order to become an MP now. And that narrows the pool. And I regret the fact that the party no longer is able to hold both pro and anti-EUs the way it used to be.
Just circling back to something you said a moment ago about 1819 being a turning point in itself, at least within Westminster, within Parliament. You mentioned the prorogation. This is a question for both of you. What was your reaction when you heard that Parliament had been prorogued? And what was your reaction when, or indeed celebration, when you heard the subsequent ruling from the Supreme Court?
Amber?
Well, I was amazed because it hadn't been discussed at Cabinet, not under Boris Johnson. It had been discussed with Theresa May briefly, but then dismissed as such an outrageous thing to do. We shouldn't even consider it. But it was leaked suddenly, I think because Jacob Rees-Mogg had been spotted. He's not a discreet-looking fellow. So it got out and it went around like wildfire on people's phones. No cabinet minister, well, obviously a few of them on the inside knew, but the rest of them didn't. And then the Prime Minister called a cabinet meeting to tell us. But I thought it was an outrageous thing to do, really. And what I really minded about it is that it wasn't honest. I mean, the reason the prorogation was done by the government was to avoid allowing the House of Commons to head off a no-deal Brexit. So it was a manoeuvre. Manoeuvres are, part of the battle that was going on between the executive and the House of Commons. But cabinet ministers were told to go out and say that this was perfectly normal. It was nothing to do with Parliament. It was all to do with the length of this Parliament that now required a prorogation and the Queen's speech. It just wasn't true. That's what I objected to.
So when I first started, I went around visiting all the different cabinet ministers, and I went into the education department and met Michael Gove and his special advisor, Dominic Cummings. And they were sitting in an office which had on the walls pictures of Vladimir Lenin, Malcolm X, and Margaret Thatcher. And I said, that's an interesting mix of people. Why have you got those on your wall of the Education Secretary's office? And both of them sort of started waxing lyrical about how they all took no prisoners and that the means were justified by the ends, basically. And that, Amber knows that this is a sort of familiar old trope with me that I sort of talk about. I have a real problem with that. I have a real problem with people who think that it is legitimate to do things that are wrong in order to do what is ultimately the right thing. And I think that that is a disease that has sort of always been rumbling around in politics, but has come to the fore a bit recently. We saw it not just in the UK, but with Trump in America, Cinque Stelle in Italy, Alternative for Deutschland, yada, yada, yada. I hope it was a sort of flare-up. But, and it's a big but, is that they would say they get results. And they do. They really do get results. And if you're, people like winning as well, don't they? If you're, so they get results.
Of course, in this case, those who just sought results by any means were ultimately unsuccessful. And the flip side to this story, of course, that Supreme Court ruled against the prorogation.
Yeah, I think you could find quite a few more examples of them being successful. That was one off. And also, I don't want to, was it unsuccessful? Okay, they got told off by the Supreme Court, but they won the election by 80 seats. So, who lost that one?
Just on the Supreme Court, do you think? Obviously, there's a propaganda war to be had, which is perhaps separate from the mechanics of how government works and what is constitutional. But do you think that was a turning point in another sense, or do you not really think the Supreme Court will make much of a difference going forward in terms of, say, the relationship between law and politics, or how politics plays out for the next 10 years?
No, I don't think it did make it. I mean, it set a new kind of level for what politicians, prime ministers can do, really. I think Craig is right. Ultimately, they managed to create a narrative of the people against the institutions. And it's just that now it wasn't just the House of Commons, it was also the courts were sort of lobbed into that. So I think it was just it felt enormous at the time, but I think it was a tiny blip.
Yeah, and look, I am a fully signed up member of the Metropolitan Liberal Elite and should probably walk around with a sort of T-shirt on it. So I have all of these values and beliefs in it. But I equally look at my fellow metropolitan liberal elite and think, boy, do you really not get it? Have you still, after all these years, not spotted what's going on or understood what's happening? And it seems to me to be a very boundary thinking quite often in terms of its inability to see beyond and why people are behaving in the way they do. And actually that was a win-win situation because it allowed them to march into a general election campaign saying, tell them again.
On all of these issues, it seems like there's a stark generational divide, and this is something I think, Craig, you mentioned before the call. Do you think the issue of Brexit, now that we've left, will go largely unchanged for the foreseeable future? Do you think it's settled for a sort of once in a generation case, or do you think that another generation might seek to overturn this? Amber, you mentioned in 2018, I think, that you thought that it might be appropriate to have a second referendum. I wonder what your thoughts on that were now.
Actually, I only said it as an alternative to leaving without a deal. I never campaigned or seriously considered a second referendum. I was just so horrified of some of my colleagues' willingness to create the cliff edge of leaving without a deal at all. There's no point thinking about rejoining the EU. There's no point from the UK's point of view, but I can tell you, have you ever had that? Have you ever tried that on a German or a Frenchman or woman? They're not going to welcome us back. No, it would be very difficult to rejoin from both sides' point of view.
The terms, I just think that the terms that we would be asked to join on, for example, signing up to the euro to start, I mean, it would be a complete non-starter in terms of persuading the British public that we should join the euro and then rejoin the EU as well. I mean, it's for the birds. Maybe in 25 years, but
I still don't think so. I just think that it's been such a scarring event, not just, well, it hasn't been, only some people think it's been scarring for the UK, and they will continue to have that view. But for the Europeans, for the rest of the EU, I mean, there's no way they will want us back in any form for at least a generation, if not, I mean, I think it'll enter their folklores, for God's sake, those Brits. As de Gaulle said, don't let them in, they'll only ruin it.
On this generational divide, Craig, you said something interesting earlier, which was that you think the sort of axis of politics have shifted from the economic to the social, cultural. Do you see this being a long-term change? And do you think that this maps onto a generational divide, or do you think it cuts across it?
No, I'm basically nicking Andrew Cooper, who runs Populus's clock face theory. But basically what he did was he did a whole load of analysis of a whole load of elections around the Western world and came up with a very compelling theory, which I think is absolutely right. And that basically people used to vote on the economic axis. And the richer and more secure you felt, the more likely you were to vote Conservative, and the poorer and less secure you felt, the more likely you were to vote Labour. Suddenly this seemed to be twisting and becoming an issue in the years running up to 2015. And now the axis has shifted completely to a social cultural one. So that you end up in a situation where the coalition that David Cameron used to win the 2015 election, which was Metropolitan Liberals and Shire Tories, is now a coalition of Shire Tories and Red Wall Labour, right? So for the shift to have happened in that way, something profound has gone on. And what it basically was, what Boris Johnson and what his strategists worked out was that the values of Shire Tories, the people who live in those kind of home county seats, are not that dissimilar to, traditional Labour voters in that, they love the Queen, support the England football team, they're not embarrassed by the flag, etc., etc., etc. And that there is another group of people who do not feel like that, and that they are highly educated professional people by and large, and other people who might traditionally have voted Lib Dem or Labour, whatever, and that the axis has shifted, and it's just not about the economics so much anymore, it's more about the social side of it. There is a young and old split. Again, I was talking to Deborah Madison, another pollster today, and she was saying that we tend to think that the young are all woke ultra-liberal. By and large, there is a split between old and young that way, but actually the young are not quite as woke as we seem to think they all are. And actually, when you move to some of these red wall seats, that they have much more values in common with their parents than you would expect. But basically, the game of politics has shifted a lot. And the way in which people vote has shifted a lot. And I think what's really interesting is, after a year of the government actually doing some pretty breathtakingly incompetent things. I mean, you think about what happened with A-levels last year. I mean, the bus was coming around the corner and about to hit Gavin Williamson, and it was there for about a week, and he still didn't get out of the way. You know, some of the earlier issues in terms of when the lockdown happened, all that kind of stuff. And yet, the government is currently 13 points clear. Why is that? What is that about? And I think a lot of people struggle to see politics as having shifted, and they struggle to move their thinking about it. And we need to think differently about it. And still, if you read newspapers and listen to lots of people, they haven't really shifted from quite an old school thinking about the way politics operates. Amber.
No, I sort of agree with what you've said. I just wondered what the trigger for that was, whether that was part of the, whether it's an evolution, Craig, or whether you think it's been triggered by the Brexit vote.
I think that, I mean, look, lots of people talk about 2008, what happened with the financial crisis. You haven't seen people's salaries grow. People didn't get a pay rise for 10 years. You know, a lot of people felt that they were having metropolitan liberal values rammed down their throat while they were struggling. A lot of people were left behind and left out, and that there was a whole conversation and party going on in London and the, you know, metropolitan circles and not in their part of the world, and they felt left behind. And a lot of it was like, you know, you talked to a lot of Americans who voted for Trump. They'd say, we know he's an idiot, but we just wanted to basically, this guy said, it said to me, you know, I was voting with my middle finger. And I just thought that is actually a really interesting thing. I did Newsnight with journalists who I won't name, who spoke a whole load of crap about Brexit all the way through. And I came off air and I said, you know what, it's really irritating. You know that's all true. And all rubbish, you know it's not true, but you just keep spouting it. And she said, yeah, but you've never worked out that really the argument is fuck you. And I thought it was the most honest thing anybody had ever said to me, that actually so much of this is motivated by fuck you. And people have struggled to understand that.
But they can understand it, but not want to do it themselves, because it's a bit, I mean, it's just, a lot of it is lying, really. I mean, do we not mind about that?
We do mind. But so Tony Blair, in his autobiography, we had it on the wall in the comms room in Downing Street, a quote from his biography, which said, for most people, politics is an irritating fog that they push to the corners of their lives. And the big mistake politicians make is thinking that people are engaged in the detail. They're not. Politicians who focus on the big picture are the people who will communicate with people directly. Tony Blair was a master at it. And actually, you know what? Dominic Cummings, Nigel Farage, they've been pretty good at it too. And it's horrible. And they quite often say things that are outrageous, complete lies, untrue. And yet
it gets cut through.
It gets through because people aren't following the detail and they're not closed. And actually, they know what, I know that's probably rubbish, but I want to vote with my middle finger anyway.
But it's also because big questions are quite complicated. And if you're going to give a truthful answer, you've probably lost your audience by the time you've tried to spell it out.
Yeah. And there's a Faustian pact between journalists and politicians as well. I'm speaking as a former journalist and somebody who was involved in politics. You kind of want to reduce everything to a very simple argument or a simple headline or a simple story. People like to feel that like there's right and wrong, black or white, left or right, up or down. And most journalism, even quite sophisticated journalism, is black or white, left or right, up or down, wrong or right. And most politics knows that if it wants to get covered effectively, it will reduce things to simplistic and binary terms. And that frustrates people, but it also is much more easy to engage with.
Yeah.
On this point of truth-telling, but also, I mean, one of these kind of major social cultural divide questions recent years has been immigration. Amber, I can't end this interview without talking about the Windrush scandal. It was revealed that you misled the Home Affairs Select Committee about the Home Office's deportation targets in the context of the Windrush scandal. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to that and ask, I mean, do you regret the omission?
Well, in fact, there was an inquiry about it afterwards led by Alex Allen, who concluded that it was regretful that I'd been given the wrong information, which is what I then communicated to the Home Affairs Select Committee. And it was led to my resignation. So what really it was about was the people who had been treated so badly. The difficulties that I had, or the apologies that I made, or the people in my office, all that is immaterial. What mattered was that the state had been treating these people, some people, so badly over quite a long period. And it happened on my watch, and it was deeply regretful. But once it came out, I felt the right thing was for me to resign. So that's what I did.
And to be fair to politicians, is that, you know, the level of detail you're expected to be across, and you're given briefing documents, and you have to expect that they're accurate. And in Amber's case, the information you'd given was wrong. And yeah, I mean, that is what is tricky about being a cabinet minister, particularly in an institution like the Home Office, which is dealing with infinitely complex, nuanced things. I mean, the old joke in Westminster is that if you're Home Secretary, you know, there's like 1,000 people doing it in any number of things which could cause you to resign at any moment. You know, how do you get a grip of this massive thing?
It's an interesting point about communications, Craig, which I might ask you based on your experiences in office. But just on the immigration point, I mean, Amber, do you think that on reflection, the thrust or the inflection of conservative immigration policy from, say, 2010 to the present day, do you think there at times that was wrong? Do you think sometimes it was too crude or too tough?
It's if you take us back to the points that Craig was making about the lead up to the Brexit debate and the immigration statistics, we were having record levels of immigration. I mean, literally, I think with 2 or 3 weeks before the actual referendum, immigration was, I cannot remember the actual number, but both EU and non-EU immigration hit a record high.
It was 330,000. It was 30 days out. And a government had said that we would get immigration down to the tens of thousands, and 30 days out from the referendum, it was more than 330,000.
And even the Leave campaigners will tell you that was the news they needed to win. So, and it did not have public consent, that scale of immigration. So, Freddie, when you ask, do we have the right sets of immigration policies? Clearly not, because immigration was at the core of the referendum vote. But whether we'll get them right going forward, I just don't know. 1 million people have apparently left during the sort of pandemic year. There is no longer freedom of movement, so I don't know who will come over from the EU to do so many of the great jobs they've been doing in the past few years. We just don't know what the future is going to hold in terms of immigration.
There are I would just mention a couple of things. So when Sajid Javid was Home Secretary, and there were like 200 people coming over in rowboats over a Christmas period, and he declared a national emergency. And at that moment, I was, come off it. This is ridiculous. You know, we've really lost the plot here. And that actually it's so pathetic that as a nation, we consider some of the most poor and desperate people in the world trying to cross the seas to get into our country a national emergency. But I also do think that a major problem happened under the Blair government, where they signed the accession treaties with Eastern Europe, and they did not have to allow the complete turning on of the taps of immigration into this country. And I think I'm right, I may be wrong, but it certainly runs into the single figure millions that came from that part of the world. And if you lived in certain towns, you were suddenly like, this is unrecognizable. There was a time in, where people were like, none of the jobs were done by anybody, basic jobs were done by anybody other than Eastern Europeans. Now, perfectly, sitting in my lovely house in Chiswick, I don't have a problem with that. I'm absolutely fine with it. I know it grows the economy and stuff. A lot of people were really unhappy about it. And then a lot of people felt, well, nobody asked me. Nobody told me. The government estimate at the time of that accession was that we would have something like 15,000 people come. And actually, it turned out being nearly 3 million. People are going to be pissed off about that. And so, unless, again, personally, you've got to be honest, you've got to be open, you've got to make the case, you've got to say that growth is entirely predicated on immigration. And if you don't have immigration into this, net immigration into this country, you're not going to have growth. We have a situation where, as we try and come back from coronavirus, we definitely need people to come in and be in our care homes, pick our apples, do all these sort of things. But people don't make the case because they're frightened and afraid of making the case. And until we have an environment where we can have open and honest conversations, it's always going to be a problem.
Do you think, in the context of the concerns, particularly in the early 2010s, about immigration within the Conservative Party, and then attempts to try and address that, do you think occasionally this meant that the wrong methods were adopted, that things were done too quickly, and this is why maybe we had the scandal that we had when you were Home Secretary, Amber?
So I've got to question your history on that. I mean, I'm like, sorry, not me, Gov. It was not, that sort of stuff was not happening. Look, when you have a terrible person who thinks it's acceptable to put vans on the street, and that was a very specific person who followed that through to a ridiculous degree when she was Prime Minister, but having vans on the street telling people to go home, they were immediately stopped from doing that and told, what the hell are you doing? Stop it. But then seemed to think it was a good idea to continue that. I don't know. I feel very uncomfortable about a lot of that kind of stuff, but it was, Theresa May insisted on a lot of it, and there were crazy things like insisting that you weren't allowed to have certain numbers of doctors coming in from, the subcontinent and stuff. I mean, it's just dreadful. But sorry, I'm probably not being very helpful here.
No, it was hard. It was hard to get it right, and the evidence shows, Freddie, that the hostile environment caught people up who it shouldn't have, and that was devastating for them, and it led to, I hope, will lead to changes. But we will see, because we're going into a new immigration system.
Thank you for that. I'm conscious of time, and we've got a couple of good audience questions, and I'd like to get those in. But my last question for you both from me, in summary, what's your biggest political regret, and what's your biggest political hope going forward?
Well, my regret is that we didn't win in the EU referendum, but it wasn't for lack of trying, because I still think it's like a slow puncture on the economy leaving the EU, and I think that we will struggle to find our place as leaders in the world when we have been. And the last thing I did as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions was to make sure that there was a trained person in each job centre to spot victims of domestic abuse and to signpost them and assist them. Those sort of small things are actually what makes you look back and think, yeah, I did some good things there.
I don't know if I'm not saying it's down to me, but I remember we went to Davos and we had dinner in Davos, and David Cameron said, like, we've got to sort out this gay marriage thing. And he sort of went around the table and said, like, where were people on it? And some people were saying, look, it's the right thing to do, but it will just really annoy the Conservative Party. It's terrible. And then others were saying, arguing for it. And then David Cameron said to me, you've been very quiet on this. And I said, well, look, my brother's gay, and he was in the Navy, and the Navy prosecuted him for being gay. And I literally went to the court every day when he was being tried for it and fined for that. And I said, and I saw that we don't live in a country that's very understanding or accepting or thoughtful on these issues. And personally, I think we've got to do something about it. And Dave Cameron sort of looked and said, yeah, that's right. You know, whenever I talk to anybody who got any vague understanding of it or are gay or whatever, I understand how important it is. And I'm really glad that was something that he did. And then I'm also very glad of the 0.7%. I think that required a lot of, that was politically very unpopular. And I'm glad that we thought it was the right thing to do, and it was. So, those were good things.
Yeah, very good. Freddie, we have to finish in a couple of minutes, but if there's one more question, I'll stay for that.
One more question from an audience member, Christopher. What are your thoughts on Keir Starmer as the leader of the Labour Party? Would you rather Starmer or Boris Johnson in number 10?
Well, I would always rather have a Conservative Prime Minister. And if I were advising Keir, I would say you've got to find some sort of wedge to differentiate yourself. At the moment, he's not making any traction at all.
I think he's having a complete nightmare at the moment, and he's discovering that Boris's policy of having his cake and eating it is a real problem for him. I've spoken to quite a few people at CCHQ. They want to keep him as leader, which is always a bad sign. And they much more fear the idea of having a figure like Andy Burnham being the leader of the Labour Party, because they think he's just much more in touch with the kind of people the Labour Party have to win over. It sounds terrible. I actually feel really sorry for him. He's got to win on all fronts. He's sitting on top of a party that was absolutely wrecked and hollowed out by Corbyn, and he's got to do two jobs. One, try and repair a political party that's absolutely in a state of utter disrepair, and also try and appeal to win against the government on all fronts at a time where people are prepared to give the government a massive benefit of the doubt. So he's got a very tough job.
Very, very last quick question for you both. Is this the end of the public politics chapter, or is there more to come?
What does that mean?
Are you going back into politics?
I'm not going back into politics, into Parliament, Amber. No,
I am not. I'm staying now in the private sector, where I'm very much enjoying myself. I'm pleased to have got out intact. So no, this is my next chapter now.
I don't think they'd have me.
Great. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for your time this evening. I appreciate you. You need to run. Thank you to everybody in the audience who submitted questions. It's always much appreciated, and I hope it proves that we can still have a lively event, even in these times on Zoom. I'd just like to make a quick plug for our events. In the coming week, we have Joe Wicks tomorrow, the body coach, and then we're back on Thursday with our usual Thursday night debate, this time on the topic, "This House Believes the Hype Around Shakespeare is Much Ado About Nothing." Thank you very much, everyone, and good night.
Harold.